Thanks very much for this generous invitation and also for that introduction. I'm showing an image here of an action that took place as part of Santiago Sierra's work at the 2001 Venice Biennale, part of the Spanish Pavilion. As one component of his project for the Spanish Pavilion at the 49th Venice Biennale, Spanish artist Santiago Sierra collected 133 persons to take part in an action. Significantly, this action took place on the opening day of the auspicious Art World event. It entailed directing the men to an area in the Arsenale, which I show you here, where he bleached all 133 persons' hair. By thus producing a visibly artificial appearance, Sierra, in effect, marked each person as though with a yellow highlighter. It subsequently became clear, as part of the work, that the delimiting criteria in selecting these 133 individuals were as follows. They were to originate from Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, or the Middle East and have dark hair. The participants had to be immigrants and refugees, legal or otherwise. The 133 yellowhead count then dispersed, returning to their everyday activities, which predominantly entailed illegal street vending on and around Piazza San Marco. The paid volunteers took no part in determining the unfolding of events, nor did they become actors in a production. They had no role in driving a narrative forward, for this was not that kind of performance. Visibility itself, on multiple registers, became the work's protagonist. While it literally highlighted heads, the cruelty of Sierra's gesture highlighted a much wider system of habituated brutality, the global exhibitionary order itself. Whatever the intentions on the part of curators, critics, viewers, artists, and art laborers, many international megashows scotamize a set of geopolitical and economic conditions upon which art events depend. In other words, 133 persons framed that which the visual regime of the exhibit occludes, the uneven value of the human. And yet it would be erroneous to see this work as yet another iteration of the critique of institutions associated with post-minimalist practices of the late 60s and early 70s. Sierra's framing device, stamped out over the body, superseded those of the critique of institutions by moving emphasis from the institution, understood as an ideological apparatus, state or otherwise, to microcosms enacting the larger violence of circulation dependent on capitalist modes of production. Sierra's work is not critical of the system it analyzes, but does provide adequately stark demonstrations of the degree to which very little differentiates working conditions in modern liberal democracy from the same depiction of a slave system, it believes to have replaced. An educated liberal art public, one that congregates every 2 years in Venice, was put in the uncomfortable position of having to confront a social reality principle best warded off. Even the charm of Venice, the sophistication of the Biennale, could not prevent uneven global economic conditions and the legal and juridical uncertainties of exclusion and disciplinary control from literally erupting into view. Sierra's work, whatever its aesthetic interest may or may not be, and in full acknowledgement of its failure as a critical art practice, much less a social intervention, does beg a few urgently necessary questions about art and work around art in contemporaneity. And now, by 2012, in our era of austerity, I'd like to use this work as a jump-off point from which to ask what resistance, that horizon of social justice with which art is so frequently tasked, would look like in a situation such as that which Sierra forcefully highlights. Indeed, what relationship could artwork have to exploitive labor practices outside of, or rather, let me start that one over. What relationship could artwork possibly have outside of the complicitous reproduction of the very conditions within which it works? Given the metabolic rate of late capital in general and the velocity of circulation in its cultural arm in particular, the general strike has come up in numerous clearinghouses of cultural production. Among them, the Biennale, the art fair, the convention-type exhibition, and so on and so forth, all of which are modeled on the world's fairs of the 19th century. Claire Fontaine, the collective whose gestures are often included in the same international art circuit, and whose work you might see in the gallery on the ground floor of this building, claims the tactic of the general strike as one necessarily impinging on art making. I'm showing one work by Claire Fontaine here. In their text entitled Ready-Made Artist and Human Strike, a few clarifications, they confront the problem of the global exhibitionary order that is the art world now with startling frankness, only to conclude that at this historical juncture, quote, the only way of assisting creation is to protect those who create nothing and are not even interested in art, end quote. Now, this declaration may strike us as extreme, if not somewhat hypocritical, and of course, for many of us, echoes Adorno's dictum that there could be no lyric poetry after Auschwitz. The latter, however, made the case for why literature had to resist this verdict, to push against cynicism. And that dictum and that verdict, of course, have become part of the critical apparatus of the last half-century. However, if we shift the problem, or rather its historical horizon, to a present characterized by global financial crisis and the promise of recession after recession, can we insist that the work of art is more necessary than ever to combat the cynicism of the present? And if so, in what way? And how can that which happens in the market push back against the cynicism of the same, of the market? How might we situate this necessity to continue to find forms of articulation within accelerated templates of control? Above all, when are we to elaborate a way to resist cynicism given our exhaustion, our anomie, our boredom, in the face of so many art fairs, so many interventions of all stripes, which feel identical, interchangeable to every other, as part of the logic of the same exhibitionary order, a kind of enforced redundancy as part of the drive to produce the new? I address here Claire Fontaine's suggestion that there can be no art under capitalism. This assertion is striking for how it fails to echo so many modernist prohibitions. The claim is not that art is not possible out of an ethical or existential stance, as though a form of protest were to withhold one's artistic genius. The collective elaborates their point of view rather more carefully, more structurally, historically, developing an argument rather than issuing a statement. The text does not function like a manifesto and is meant to manifestly undermine the object production of the collective. Rather, their work makes it clear, their work makes the case that the conditions under which the making of a work is possible are themselves under extreme duress, hence the contradiction between statement and work. It is simply not possible to make work, which doesn't mean we won't all keep circulating as if it were, as evidenced here. The collective forefronts the problem from a point of view of the artist who is expected to deliver expressive consciousness within the determinations of a support which is itself the product of accelerated subsumption in manufacturing, the ready-made, be it a canvas, be it video, or be it digital. They note the contradictions in which the practitioner is to deliver the effect, if not of exceptional artisanal skill, at least in experience other to instrumental, profit-oriented logic of everyday life, even as they work within a matrix of equivalence enforced by a regime of value. As Claire Fontaine points out, quote, located in the forced intimacy between human beings and all sorts of vulgar and odious objects, which constitute the daily life of the majority under advanced capitalism, this continuity between human beings and objects, has produced effects on our subjectivities far more pernicious than even those Marx was able to describe. End quote. Against this, the collective poses the term strike. I quote again. This type of strike interrupts the total mobilization to which we are all submitted, and that allows us to transform ourselves first and foremost. This might be called a human strike, for it is the most general of general strikes, and its goal is the transformation of the informal social relations on which domination is founded. By its light, the rationality of the behaviors we adopt in our everyday life would appear to be entirely dictated by the acceptance of economic relationships that regulate them. Each gesture, each constructive activity in which we invest ourselves has a counterpart within a monetary economy. The human strike decrees the bankruptcy of these principles and installs other affective and material fluxes. End quote. So let's define some terms. Outside the fishbowl of the art world, a general strike is an organized refusal to work on the part of a critical mass of laborers. It's a tactic attendant upon and responsive to the specific capitalist form of accumulation, which we could crudely define as the privatization of the means of production for the sole purposes of profit, divorced from human experience or need. Having variously emerged and receded as a broadly recognized means of resistance since the mid-19th century, which incidentally is around the same time as the development of the art fair, and I'd like to note that very purposively. The potential of a general strike to precipitate capitalism's inherent tendency to crisis was recently forcefully expressed by anti-austerity movements in Greece and Spain, among numerous other geopolitical sites. Operationally, a general strike interrupts the availability of labor, foundational to the production of value. Foundational to a system that valorizes things over people. And again, not from some ideological vantage, not from the vantage of ideological critique, but through the very mechanisms of production, and thereby other life processes pressed into service by capitalist modes of production. The structural necessity of capital is to drive higher returns at lower costs, an equation in which labor, otherwise known as people, become cheap and expendable, a depletable resource. At stake is the degree to which a strike is less a matter of ethical resistance to social injustice and more a tactical form of survival in the face of immiseration. Now, I use the term immiseration in its lay sense, but also with reference to Marx and Engels' thesis, also known as the general law of capitalist accumulation, in which they argue that production requires the impoverishment. This isn't a matter of a little problem that needs to be worked out within systems of capitalist valorization. Requires the impoverishment of laborers through an ever greater reduction in wages and indeed the redundancy of the laborer himself or herself. On the sunny side, however, inevitable redundancy signals capitalism's inevitable decline, a sense that this hegemon too will one day cede to another. Of note here is the insight that egregiously violent and inhuman conditions for workers who produce value for others such as that we see protested from China to Indonesia to the United States. In the past month alone, of note would be the Walmart strike, again, are not a matter of ethical social choices, but an inherent structural function of capitalist means, irrespective of human agency. Or better, the only agency left in the face of capital is whether to acknowledge that, far from natural, it will abolish itself as a function of recent history, or whether to assist its regime by putting off its collapse. Claire Fontaine's addendum of human to general strike notes the role of culture as a facilitator for the cruelty of capitalism. The collective draws on a particular history of leftist resistance to frame their emphasis of the artist as a ready-made, a life made possible by processes of reproduction, rather than an object of art as a ready-made. So just to go over that quickly, the major point of Claire Fontaine's work is that the subject slowly becomes part of the condition, the ready-made condition that informs objects. In light of this insight, they evoke the wages for housework movement initiated within the feminist movement, organized around the Libreria della Donne in Italy in the late 1970s. The latter posited a general strike as an expanded constellation of strategies enacted in areas of social life, in everyday life, not bound up with value production, not part of production on the factory floor. Claire Fontaine again tries to signal its interest in the extra productive branches of making, namely art making, through the word human. Their interest is in the informal movement organized around the Libreria della Donne. Again, the practices that Claire Fontaine draws on are not part of the labor movements of the 70s, but rather those sites of support around labor movements that look to social life, domestic life, everyday life, not involved with labor, to make their point. So they were interested in historically developed categories that are part of the capitalist reorganization of life. This always happens. Yet couched as natural and self-evident. Social categories such as the nuclear family, the modern home, and the organization of public versus private. The Bolognian Collective for Domestic Salary, on which Claire Fontaine draws, said, quote, "If we strike, we won't leave unfinished products or untransformed raw materials. By interrupting our work, we won't paralyze production, but rather the reproduction of the working class itself. And this would be a real strike, even for those who normally go on strike without us," end quote. The point there being that in order to interrupt the flows of capital, one has to locate those matrices that produce labor rather than simply labor itself. Although women associated with the movement, with the Libreria della Donne movement, noted Marx's relative blindness to the problem of gender as labor, their striking insight was to finally take seriously Marx's analysis of the commodity in its totality. Quote, "Labor is the creator of use value, as useful labor is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal, natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself," end quote. Divorcing wages from work, calibrated against the clock, the metaphor of rationalization for sociologists such as Weber, the feminist collective hoped to disable not only a system of primitive accumulation and organization making capital possible, but also fundamentally the very logic of quantification subtending general equivalence. This disarticulation of wage and work elaborated itself under the rubric of autonomy, not to be confused, of course, with aesthetic autonomy in the 20th century. Their suggestion then was to target value, that which derives from and enforces equivalence, and that runs more deeply than the money form. And finally, that the general strike is the right tactic through which to do so. Of interest to me in this regard, then, are other recent attempts on the part of artists to explicitly address the problem of making and producing work in a cultural sphere. While it may be self-evident that, as Theodore Adorno put it, there is no material content, no formal category of artistic creation, however mysteriously transmitted and itself unaware of the process which did not originate from the empirical reality from which it breaks, I would argue that the rubric of social justice has done much to obscure the relation, the chain of mediation between work and its empirical reality. That horizon, or what that might mean in 2012, is precisely what's at stake in the work of Claire Fontaine. Now, quickly, just to go back and think about the ready-made briefly. Understood as a form of institutional critique, the ready-made once gloried in its capacity to shock and to think the conditions of modernity as recontextualization, as the uprooting of perception and cognition. The special paradigm shift, if we can call it that, brought to bear by Claire Fontaine, is to see the ready-made from the vantage of immiseration, in which the ready-made suggests less an easily recuperated vanguardist object, and more a hidden vanishing point that sets the terms for the general condition in which we now find ourselves. All of everyday life as a ready-made. Marx uses the term subsumption to delineate the technical conditions, the technical conversions in production processes that are designed to extract more relative surplus value. Subsumption does not refer to changes in non-value productive sectors, the cultural arm of basically any other part of life other than the factory floor. What Claire Fontaine does by locating the ready-made is to explore the effects of subsumption on perception, on reception, on judgment, and above all, on subjectivization. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'll just introduce Randy Lee Cutler, and she'll come up here with her response. So whether through performance art, experimental video, photographs, recipes, interventions in gallery windows, or critical writing, Randy Lee Cutler's practice explores the aesthetics of appetite, agency, and embodiment. She's authored numerous essays published in C Magazine, Pyramid Power, the Philip Review, Vancouver Art and Economies, Uncanny, Experiments in Cyborg Culture, Fuse Magazine, West Coast Line, and Paradoxa, Black Flash Magazine, Canadian Art, and Yishu Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. On topics as diverse as digestion, truth-telling, that's my favorite, Orientalism, feminism, photography, and social change. Originally from Montreal, she lives in Vancouver, where she is an associate professor at Emily Carr University. Randy?
Hello. Thank you for inviting me, and Jaleh for your talk. What I decided to do was to try to take up this phrase general strike, which is how this evening has been billed, and maybe to give it, to take it in a different direction, maybe a direction that's kind of maybe grounding us, and then we can sort of, I think, in some ways triangulate between what Jaleh has offered, what I'm offering, and Jeff will propose after that. So I just wanted to sort of basically say that my approach here has been to sort of really think about language. The general strike is something that I've thought about when I go and walk on demonstrations. It's something that I think about in a kind of immediate sense in Vancouver and my relationship to it. But what I wanted to do here was talk about it in relationship to language in particular. So what I thought I would do is go toward my first impulse, which is to think like a dictionary, which I'm sure a lot of us do. You sort of come across a term that sort of seems like a given, and then you start to read about it, and you realize it's a lot more complicated. And I think we have a sense of the general strike in relationship to labor, but there are so many ways that we can come in it. So my first question is, what is the general strike? And I just sort of found, these are kind of your kind of general descriptions of the general strike. But what's intriguing is, as you start to look at it, there are very different positions and interpretations of the general strike. So I find that quite fascinating. So dictionary.com, I sort of did very cursory, very accessible approach to it. General strike, a mass strike in all or many trades and industries in a section or in all parts of a country. That seems relatively straightforward. You sort of take this further, and I was particularly intrigued by this one, which I found, businessdictionary.com, which says, general strike is the widespread withdrawal of labor from most or all industries aimed at extracting concessions by paralyzing the economy of a country or region. General strikes are rare in developed countries, the last one being in 1926 in the UK in support of the miners' union. It lasted for 9 days but failed to achieve its objectives. So you can probably already see where I'm going here. I was just so fascinated that the general strike is something that we all know, and we think we know, and obviously within a kind of cultural production context, it's taken on new meaning, particularly in relationship to Claire Fontaine's exploration of the human strike. But here you can already see these biases that are there. So when I was reading this, I was particularly fascinated by phrases like extracting concessions by paralyzing the economy. It's a very particular take on it. But also the other part of this that fascinated me, and this is this kind of, I don't know what the word is, when you sort of start researching something and it takes you here and it takes you there, and then you find yourself somewhere else entirely. Is there a word for that? Kind of, right? That's kind of rhizomatic, you're right. So one of the points here being the last one being 1926 in the UK, wrong, right? Wrong. So I started looking at descriptions and histories of the general strike, and since 1926, there was a general strike in 1932 in Geneva. There was the 1933 French general strike. There was the 1934 West Coast longshoremen strike in the States, Minneapolis Teamsters strike in 1934 as well, another one in Toledo, Ohio, the auto light strike. There was a strike in France again in 1936 and another in 1968. Luxembourg had a strike in 42. Oakland in 46. Austria and Belgium also had their own strikes in 1950. The Finnish strike, 1956. 1974, the Ulster Workers' Council strike in Northern Ireland. In 1988, the Spanish general strike, on and on. So it's interesting how you sort of come across this information, and not only is the language egregious, but also it's wrong in so many ways. And so it was kind of satisfying to sort of see where this took me. So I'm just going to continue a little bit more with these definitions. So here's another one from infoplease.com. I am not supporting these more populist sites necessarily, but they are the way in which a lot of us access, if only in the first instance, thinking about these ideas. So infoplease.com offered a sympathetic cessation of work by a majority of the workers in all industries of a locality or nation. So just interesting the differences between this notion of a sympathetic cessation versus the extracting concessions by paralyzing the economy. So I was quite intrigued by this, and intrigued by one of the things I was thinking about. Jeff was saying that he's going to talk about some of his own experiences in relationship to the strike, and thinking about my own early encounters when I was living in Montreal, going to CEGEP. I took a course called Socialist Thought, and came home discussing some of the ideas I learned with my father, who got very angry with me for talking about revolution and talking about general strike. So it's interesting how these things are both personal and embodied, but also how we access them in each cultural moment. So there's more. The New Dictionary of Cultural Literacy offers a strike of all the workers in a nation or area. General strikes are usually brief and designed to show the unity of the working class. So it's a little more neutral than the others, but still offers a particular perspective. This one also, this one was in keeping with the Business Directory from Cambridge, a strike in which most people in a country refuse to work until they are given higher pay or something else they want. And I was kind of struck by this kind of simplistic description of the general strike, and also this very casual way of saying anything else they want. So I sort of started doing this and was quite fascinated by the fact that the general strike is not a given. We think we know what it is, but I think that in each context, whether the shop floor, cultural contexts, 1988, 1934, 2012, it takes on different meanings. And I think that's what I'm particularly fascinated by. So in addition to thinking like a dictionary, I also like to try to think like a thesaurus, slightly different than a dictionary. Rather than looking for definitions, you're looking for similar language and similar phrases. Intriguingly, I was looking for synonyms for general strike. And so that you have arbitrate, be on strike, boycott, go on strike, hit the bricks, don't know what that means, hold out, mediate, mutiny, negotiate, picket, quit, refuse to work, resist, revolt, sit down, sit in, stick out, stop, tie up. But what I was most fascinated by in this process was the fact that there were a lot of synonyms for strike as a verb, but within the thesaurus I was looking at, there was no equivalent for the noun. So strike was seen as a verb, as an action, but not as a kind of event. So this kind of was quite interesting. I haven't really thought it through beyond that, but I find that quite fascinating. So then the next step I would sort of take, actually let me go back a bit, is this kind of surprise. Like every time I'm looking at this, I'm surprised by the language, I'm surprised by the context, I'm surprised by the framing, and that's good. It means things are still fresh in some way, and I'm not jaded. So there's a kind of interesting way that we move through language and sort of take it on with our own experience. So clearly thinking like a dictionary has not provided a solid foundation from which to speak. And yet the range of definitions does speak to the shaky ground, the biased context, and the misinformed histories. So as I continue this exploration of the general strike, I discovered the various origins of this term. So I wanted to offer this here. So I started doing a little bit of etymology. So I'm doing some dictionary work, thinking like a dictionary, I'm thinking like a thesaurus, I'm thinking like an etymologist. So here's one offering, which is quite interesting, basic. The general strike refers to a concentrated cessation of work by a body of employees. Apparently in 1810, it was used from the verb meaning refuse to work to force an employer to meet demands. In 1768, it comes from the verb strike, perhaps from the notion of striking or downing one's tools, or from sailors practicing of striking or lowering the ship's sails as a symbol of refusal to go to sea, from 1968, and this preserves the verb's original sense of to make level or smooth. So these things I think are interesting. They slow us down. Jaleh talked about, and I'm going to make a reference to this, the idea of metabolism and velocity, and I'm kind of interested in slowing things down and thinking about them, providing some kind of space around it. So this was quite interesting in that the strike comes from this idea of literally a physical action, a verb, but doesn't really take us into these events. You also have strike action as in this here. This is the earliest example I found. The strike tactic has a very long history. Towards the end of the 20th dynasty under Pharaoh Ramses III in ancient Egypt, apparently on the 14th of November, I don't know where that one came from 1152 BC, the artisans of the royal necropolis of Deir el-Medina organized the first known strike or workers' uprising in recorded history. And this is quite intriguing when you look at the general strike and its history. It sort of talks about it in terms of the modern era, but there are longer histories of it. It might not have been called general strike so specifically, but these events happened. And here's another one. The first general strike may have been this original event in ancient Rome. In the Outline of History, H.G. Wells recorded the general strike of the plebeians. The plebeians seem to have invented the strike, which it now makes its first appearance in history. So this idea of what is the general strike, I think, is under contention, and also when it first happened is also under contention, shaky ground. So their first strike, accordingly, in ancient Rome, first occurred because they saw with indignation their friends who had often served the state bravely in the legions thrown into chains and reduced to slavery at the demand of patrician creditors. The use of the word strike in English first appeared apparently in 1768, when sailors in support of demonstrations in London struck or removed the top-gallant sails of merchant ships at port, thus crippling the ships. Official publications have typically used the more neutral words work stoppage or industrial dispute. So there's a lot of language around this, which is quite fascinating. So the other thing I wanted to point out, I'm not expecting you to read all of this, but it is quite fascinating to see the history. This is what I could find. There's probably a lot more. There's this elaborate history of the general strike. So actually, it's not this kind of state of exception. In some ways, perhaps it's something that is part of each of our own cultural moments in some way. And I just want to highlight here the 1926, the UK general strike, apparently the last one that's happened in the developed world. And clearly, we've had many general strikes since then. So who do you trust, right? So I see this as an issue of who writes these histories and in what context. This seems to be very important. So my point here is to acknowledge that even the general strike as a word, as a phrase, or a history is not self-evident. It seems to me that perhaps a strike can be understood as not doing as much as doing. It certainly is a verb. It's also a noun. But this idea of the human strike, which Jaleh was sort of pointing to, as a way of sort of not acting as opposed to acting, as a way of not responding to being turned into subjects by the social context in which we live. That is, it can be conceived as a recognition that it's not simply labor issues that are the problem, but the system in general. This type of strike that interrupts the total mobilization to which we are all submitted and that allows us to transform ourselves, this is from Claire Fontaine, might be called a human strike. So we've already heard a bit about it, and I think Jeff is going to take it up as well. And this is where it gets really interesting in relationship perhaps to art production and also cultural production. The quote continues, I sort of offer it here, by its light, the rationality of the behaviors we adopt in our everyday life would appear to be entirely dictated by the acceptance of the economic relationships that regulate them. Each gesture and each constructive activity in which we invest ourselves has a counterpart within the monetary economy or the libidinal economy. The human strike decrees the bankruptcy of these two principles and installs other affective and material fluxes. So this is, I think, this whole essay sort of takes this up, but this seems to start to describe this notion of the human strike. So how might we consider the general strike in this larger field of the human strike? And Jaleh, in her description for this talk, cites Marx, and she offers this quote from Marx, labor as the creator of use value, as useful labor, is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of society. It is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature and therefore human life itself. So you can imagine my excitement when I saw the word metabolism, because I'm doing a lot of work now on digestion, absorption, assimilation, its relation to the body, to temporality. So I was quite intrigued by this reference to metabolism. This quote seems to me quite useful to consider the idea of the metabolic rate of lay capital in general, as Jaleh has offered, and the velocity of circulation in its cultural production in particular. Whether thinking through artistic practices or more generalized responses to our current economic crisis, how do we ingest, absorb, and assimilate contemporary global politics and the call for a general strike from Spain to Greece, Egypt to Oakland? How are we all submitted and submit to this bankrupt economic regime in our everyday lives? How are our behaviors and desires and appetites exclusively dictated by the acceptance of the economic relationships that regulate them? And what is our potential response to them, this idea of the human strike, the idea of not doing, the idea of not submitting in some way? So finally, I offer how might we think otherwise? More specifically, in considering our current economic crisis, how might we imagine social formations that are no longer based on the pre-existing system of social relations? Obviously a huge question, but I think that's the question that Jaleh has posed, and that's the question that I would also offer. What might the general strike mean in the context of this human strike, in the context of not doing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. That was great. We were comparing notes on the history of general strikes right before the talk, and I was kind of delighted to discover that the first general strike in North America happened in Winnipeg, of all places, in 1919. I think maybe it was just a month before the one that happened in Seattle in the same year. Oh, yeah? Oh, well, you can add that to the list on Wikipedia. I'll introduce Jeff Dirksen, who's our next respondent. Jeff has really edited his bio, so it's going to be short. He currently works in the English department at Simon Fraser University. He collaborates on visual art and research projects focusing on urban issues with the research collective Urban Subjects. And his new book on art and architecture will be called After Euphoria, and it's published by JRP Ringier, and it should be out in... It's currently in production and will be out soon.
It's great to see. It's great to see that the list of general strikes starts growing, even as soon as we start thinking about it. Thanks, for setting this up and for inviting me, and thanks, Jaleh, for the great paper. So I'll try and bounce off that in a slightly different register. So I'm going to take a slightly discursive register than I normally do, and reflect on strikes and the potentials and weaknesses of a general strike through my experience of them. This is not to centralize a narrative subject. I think we have the CBC to do that for us. But to try to stick together the scales of affects, even solidarities and antagonisms that strikes ignite. And this is in the context of two work actions that are taking place in my own work site, which this is an extended part of, a site of both the production of knowledge and the eventual production of surplus, the neoliberal sausage factory, as Neil Smith has called the contemporary university. So the TSSU, the teachers and the teaching assistants union is on strike, or has a strike vote, as does the staff union CUPE. So this, to me, is kind of interesting material fact, given that my own education with its disjunctive history is marked by strikes. However, the strikes I'll talk of are of labor and social strikes, but not strikes that held a revolutionary prospect. I'd never lived the experience of a strike being the shortest, surest, and easiest means of springing into a better social future, even if that is fanciful, as Rosa Luxemburg points out. But the mass strike does shine a kind of horrifying light on both the weaknesses of labor and the strengths of the capitalist police state, as Luxemburg, that's one of her hinges. Strikes also do more than this. I mean, they test the waters in different ways, and they show both the possibilities of alliances and their impossibility due to the distortion of capital, and how its valuation is refracted into even the social air between us. So my first encounters with strikes was when my father's union, the United Paper Makers and Paper Workers Union, which was an international, and then later the Canadian Paper Workers Union, when they literally localized, struck, and we would go down to the picket line with my mom, who was an operator at BC Tel, which is our former telephone system, which has since been privatized, and she was a member of the Telecommunication Workers Union. So we'd go down there with sandwiches and soup for the guys who'd hit the bricks, who were on the line, and they were there with the fire in the oil tank, in the oil can, in the 50-gallon oil drum. What I recall about that strike, those early strikes, was, our family worrying about getting by on strike pay and the anxiety that the strike doesn't drag on. And I think they did get a wage settlement at that time. So it was a victory or an adjustment within the system, or in some sense both. Later, going to the small arts college in Nelson, BC, the David Thompson University Center, where I studied writing, the staff went on strike 2 years writing, and since the school was small, modeled on Black Mountain College, there was great solidarity with the strikers. For the bulk of the semester, we didn't cross the line, holding our classes informally in the student union. Only one faculty member, curiously a novelist, crossed the line, and the students refused to follow. So this kind of labor action and social solidarity made it easy for DTUC to be closed in our first wave of neoliberalism in BC, which in some ways intensifies in 1983 when the so-called restraint budget was put through in what at the time was seen as a ridiculous omnibus bill. It was 26 bills under one, rolled into one by the Social Credit Party, which is a party that has itself been closed, as my university was, but they've been reborn as a kind of smudgy, stinky phoenix as the BC Liberals. So this economic restructuring that we live in at the moment, in which Claire Fontaine are trying to map and mark in some ways, is in the wake of these moments of early neoliberalization, and the restructuring of our daily and economic lives in the way that economic and daily have been, unfortunately, too conjoined. So this restructuring ignited the fuse for the redistribution of wealth upwards, of the weakening of labor's rights and the possibility to organize, of renters to rent, of students to study, of the hospitals to take care of folks, and of those on welfare to live in dignity, and so on and so on. It was also the beginning of a cultural project that slowly swung toward the valorization of a FIRES economy: finance, insurance, real estate, and service. Like a tanker swinging in the tide, post-Keynesianism gave way to neoliberal autonomization and revanchism. Fuck the poor, for they have fucked themselves. Love the rich, for they love themselves. Two sad slogans of our times. So a grand reform and a lasting compromise and its stabilities gave way to something worse: a participation, a collaboration. This is the shitty fundament we stand on today. But the 1983 restraint budget and the taking apart of the social contract led to the largest labor and social mobilization since the 1930s in BC, where we came very close to a general strike, just a few baton swings away from a general strike. A strike at points of production, but also a strike at the points of social reproduction. But not a mass strike such as 1905 in St. Petersburg, which both Trotsky and Luxemburg write passionately about. Luxemburg pointing to its long genesis at the point where liberalism was exhausted, the action of the proletariat began, and until a spontaneous general shaking and tugging of the chains of capitalism began. Mario Tronti, on the other hand, in another place, dampens this. The anarcho-syndicalist general strike, which was supposed to provoke the collapse of capitalist society, is a romantic naivety from the word go, he writes. I mention the 1905 strikes not because I think the conditions today would allow for this, would spark the effects or the romanticism, but because, as a poet, is the most direct material relationship of language and labor and revolution. As Trotsky writes in his memoir of 1905, the typesetters at Sitin Printworks in Moscow struck on September 19th. They demanded a shorter working day and a higher piecework rate per 1,000 letters, not excluding punctuation marks. This small event set off nothing more nor less than the all-Russian political strike, a strike which started over punctuation marks and ended by felling absolutism. And who would not want their letters to do the same today, to fell a new neoliberal absolutism? Yet in August of 1983, 40,000 people, including cops as union members, joined a protest at Empire Stadium on Hastings Street against the restructuring of the restraint budget. In October, 60,000 people gathered at the Queen Elizabeth Playhouse just up the street. You can notice the colonial theme running through this, outside the Social Credit Convention. In Nelson, we started the fight to save our little university, setting up a media campaign, working with retired folks to occupy the library, etc. They were great. They had lots of time. They stayed for 6 months. In November, in a moment that is still contested today, in memory and in media, in a last-minute closed door behind the back bargaining, IWA regional head Jack Monroe, a classic pork chopper, devised a deal with Premier Bill Bennett at Bennett's home in Kelowna. The so-called Kelowna Accord lowered the sales. I was using this nautical metaphor, but it turns out it was actually quite accurate in terms of strikes then. Lowers the sales on the moment to a general strike, and Operation Solidarity that was coordinating it. For our Urban Subjects project that we did with Bick Vanderpoel at the Western Front, I tried to find a copy of an image of that handshake, which was burned into my mind. Even after hours of digging through labor archives, media archives, speeding through reels of microfiche, almost 30 years old now, flipping through contact sheets of press photographs, holding negatives up to light, and turning dried newspaper pages, the images couldn't be found. Even the precise date and time didn't churn up the image. Sunday, November 13th, 1983, around 10:30 at night in Kelowna, BC. But everyone agreed that the image existed, and everyone had a clear idea of it. Two bulky men on a patio of a home, backlit by a yellow living room light, caught by an agreement in the slow shutter speed, shaking hands. Two men, backlit, shaking hands. After that handshake, the pickets fomenting a general strike came down, and the unlikely antagonistic coalition of union pork choppers and dykes on the drive, moving towards the most massive protest in the province's history, shifted gears and vowed to fight on. The public, the private, the collapse of those. So I want to make a shift to the notion of social reproduction and that encompasses the broad range of practices and social relations that maintain and reproduce particular relations of production, along with the material and social grounds in which they take place. It is as much the fleshy, messy, indeterminate stuff of everyday life as it is a set of structured practices that unfold in dialectical relationship to production, with which it is mutually constitutive and in tension. So I'm paraphrasing Cindy Katz here. Katz's notion of social reproduction gives the temporal and spatial elements of a general strike and of a human strike. I think it draws those two together. A strike of social reproduction resists the atomization of work and life, of production and consumption. And she writes, if the political economic aspect of social reproduction takes place in some combination of the household, the market, the workplace, civil society, and the state, the relationship imbalance amongst settings varies across time, space, class, and nation, amongst other things. So I think what Cindy Katz, the geographer, is doing is to provide us a way to think of, in this context, a strike that joins points and sites of production, even if this is the computer on your kitchen table, and social reproduction, which would include schools and other public grounds, other sites of consumption. Her term for this joining is this articulation is topographies of global capitalism. In this way, the human strike could never be simply local. A more difficult question is, what is art and the artist's role or place in this? To bring up, to remind an imagined audience of the dangerous affects of a strike, affects that never fully simmer down, or to point to future potentials, new forms of action, new social subjects rejecting revanchism. Also, we can see in this a point of contact, as Marina Vishmit calls it, between working class struggles and other social movements, feminism, students, the queer movement, and other social minorities. In our context, we have to add First Nation struggles as well. As Vishmit says, in that subjectivity is now a contested territory in what was then being seen in autonomous Marxism in the 1970s as a post-industrial terrain where sensibility, cognition, and sociability was becoming more directly productive for capital. It was now the social factory. This leads Vishmit argues in a language similar to Katz to the discourse of subjectivity in its political or aesthetic register as a topology of the unproductive, a topology of the unproductive. I make and teach poetry in the social factory. A poem, unlike 1,000 pieces of lead type, cannot ignite a mass strike. And you can't drive a Chevy through a post-Fordist landscape. But a poem can refuse to reproduce the social relations that drafts wealth upwards and piles coals on those structurally marginalized. A poem can love and live its negations productively. Thanks.
I think now I'll ask all three of you to come up and have a seat here, and we'll continue the discussion. Thanks very much for that, Jeff. Just in thinking about Randy, your response, and Jeff, your response as well. I mean, both of you took this idea, sort of ran with this idea of the general strike, and then sort of attempted to define it, but then at the same time kind of stretched out the definition so that we can see how broadly it's been used and how sort of malleable a term it is. Just in terms of what we just heard, Jaleh, I wonder if you wanted to respond to some of the things that they brought up.
The thought that struck me above all was this idea that while we might be able to look at the general strike historically, or we might be able to think anecdotally or in various number of ways about this, I don't know if we want to call it a concept, it's much more than that. What struck me, though, as perhaps missing from a historical or any other way of looking at it is the structural problem we have at present, in which we have a crisis in value production, as signaled in any number of ways over the last decade, most notably 2008. And it seems that we've hit a point of kind of general redundancy where there will soon be no choice. It won't be a matter of looking to historical models as in search of forms of resistance. It won't be, I can leave it at that. That is very much my concern and my interest in Claire Fontaine's work. Shifting from a kind of politics of labor history to a matter of crisis-driven inevitability. So,
Randy, Jeff, do you want to respond?
Yeah, Claire Fontaine start with the 1970s as a recuperation of a particular form of strike that tries to articulate, to join or overlay sites of social reproduction with points of production. So in some ways, they're pointing to a moment where subsumption of value production, subsumption of labor, was not simply at particular points that were disarticulated, right, weren't separate. So they look for this moment, this historical moment that seems to have some correlative with our crisis that we have now, the ongoing crises, and from that to bring that forward. So I don't know, in some ways, if we read the value of that as the value of that kind of mining of historical moments, whether they're the lost moments of modernism, which Stan Douglas has said is the way that his career is coordinated around, or if we look at that as a political exercise on the part of Claire Fontaine to find a historical correlative that you can bring forward that will alter when we bring it forward, and then we'll have, let's say, move that from archive value into use value. And as you pointed out, all of this takes place within the value system of the art market. So it still seems to me that we're a little tangled within the historical mining of these moments, which can be productive in some way.
Well, I would add to that notion of the mining of historical moments to find their use value in the present, their redefinition of the ready-made, too. That the ready-made would not be a gesture or a strategy of radical critique, but would be the condition for the possibility or the condition for the impossibility of acting now. I think that that's really where their greatest insight lies, and where, far from putting forward a completely nihilistic viewpoint, they're actually presenting a thin seam that maybe some of us could insert ourselves into or somehow mobilize as a kind of the kind of silver lining of this very negative approach.
So Are you saying that the silver lining is the impossibility of any kind of action?
The impossibility of the impossibility of value production, given given the problem of redundancy and the crisis in production at the level of the factory floor that then ramifies in everyday life and in sites of social reproduction. What they seem to be suggesting is that if we heed this call, can look to various forms of withdrawal or subtraction, or that we might find emancipatory gestures where we least expect them, because we've painted ourselves into this corner.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is, for myself, in order to think about the general strike in this context, I have to do a bit of the historical contextualization and then start to read about the human strike as it's articulated by Claire Fontaine and other writers coming out of Italy and France. And this idea of the impossibility of action I find quite fascinating. I guess another way to look at it, not just in cultural production, but in our everyday lives, is the kind of impetus to work and the kind of expectation that we all want to be millionaires in some way. So I guess what I'm interested in terms of the general strike and the human strike is solidarity with labor disputes, but also solidarity in some way. And I'm conflicted about this because I love to work. I enjoy my work. But I also respect that not everybody has that same kind of relationship, and sometimes the impossibility of response is in some ways quite inspiring. The idea that there are larger social contexts that put pressure on us. So I guess there's a kind of spectrum of responses, and that's, in a sense, what I was sort of looking at, is that there are these spectrum of responses, and this impossibility of action, you'd call it this kind of silver lining, is an interesting notion, and the idea of not acting as a kind of action. The idea of, one of the things I was reading today in terms of the Italian feminists was this notion of an aggressive silence. I don't really know what that means. I find it really interesting because my whole history has been about a kind of feminist queer project where you're not silent. So the notion of an aggressive silence it's kind of confounding, but also quite interesting, this idea of a withdrawal and the idea of impossibility. So, yeah.
I actually had a question for you, Jaleh, as well, in response to your talk, which is around the inclusion of Santiago Sierra specifically, because I understand the relationship between the human strike and Claire Fontaine. Obviously, they've written about it. It's part of their the kind of discursive apparatus around their work. But Santiago Sierra, less so. In fact, he used this great word when you describe the project that he did at Venice, which it was by dyeing everybody's hair, it was as if to highlight them, as if with a highlighter. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, he highlights a form of labor, but and a form of labor that, true, we might not otherwise have been attentive to, but nonetheless, the people continue to go and work throughout Venice over the course of the biennial. So in a sense, there's no cessation of labor. So I'm wondering how Santiago really fits into the thesis and what links there are with Claire Fontaine, other than a kind of general one about labor.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I really appreciate that. I situate Santiago Sierra in order to demonstrate that this idea that we inherit from the critique of institutions, from artwork of the 60s and 70s, of making visible inequities, social injustices, those kinds of tactics seem to no longer function as they once had. That visible forms of critique seem to be very easily absorbed into a system of kind of reproduction of inequality. And we've reached an impasse where withdrawal seems to be the only response. I'm using Sierra as a way of showing the inefficacy of certain kinds of social justice art tactics, pointing to, always highlighting, framing, showing, exposing the lie, unveiling the various problematic dynamics in any given situation or context, it isn't quite enough. It becomes part of a machinery of enforced redundancy. And so the point was simply to say that we've reached another moment where some of the critical apparatus that we might have inherited from previous generations, they're not holding up to our historical horizon.
There's a really interesting point through the paper where you're talking about interrupting the flows of capital. And so, some of the ways that I was pointing out was, that traditionally we would interrupt the production of the commodity in terms of Fordism on the factory floor, which becomes more difficult today in post-Fordist times. Another way is to blow up a pipeline, which has happened in BC and will happen again. Another way is to, and this may be what I was thinking about in terms of the human strike, was that to interrupt the flow of labor as a commodity. So in some sense, the human strike is to stop the production of labor as a commodity. So it goes back to one of Marx's central point that labor itself is a commodity, and it's not just that commodities themselves are produced out of nowhere, but rather labor itself is a commodity. So in some sense, I guess I'm making a little bit of a wiggle where I want to look at I want to expand more productively the idea of production, so that we don't have to move away from an idea of interrupting flows of capital that are in a human strike that also doesn't think through the problematic of production. Because I think the respatialization of production, in some sense, is one of the key factors whether strikes could be effective or not. And it seemed to me that the human strike respatializes that as well, but by bringing it into domestic spaces, and bringing it into other spaces as well.
Yeah, exactly. So when Claire Fontaine talks about a crisis in value, they're also referring to changes in modes of production that we could associate, as you mentioned, with post-Fordism. So the problem there is that if value is no longer being produced the way it once was on a factory floor, if value is more about circulation in the social spaces of consumption and social reproduction than it's making on the factory floor, then clearly spaces that are outside of production have to be targeted, most notably that of the private and domestic sphere that makes labor possible, labor as the most kind of fundamental commodity, the most fundamental form of production within capital. So, yeah, that's the very special insight of autonomous Marxism, specifically in its feminist guise, that is of interest to Claire Fontaine. But I think one thing that you bring up in that comment is the degree to which it's incumbent upon us to locate those places of circulation of value that we don't always think about as a form of strike. So one of those might be mass debt default or things of that nature. It's not possible to have these strikes on the factory floor because that's not where value... It's only one among many sites of the production of value. So the financial sector would be a place to strike.
Yeah, I guess just thinking it through in terms of that uneven development and uneven temporal development, a strike on the factory floor in China means something completely different to us who have living through a great moment of Fordism. So that seems to mean something different to us, but to target those, and I think in the way the multiple sites that Randy Lee is pointing to as well. But it seemed like one site that maybe we all pointed towards was to think of the subject or subjectivity as a site of production as well, and to think through what a kind of a human strike might be at that scale or that within that site.
And along those lines, a set of strikes that are especially interesting to me are the sex strikes on the part of women, most notably in Kenya, but other countries as well, in 2009, as a form of protesting gender inequity that then sets the condition for value production outside of the home. So, I think we'll start to see various iterations of the strike that are rather counterintuitive or surprising that would look to those kinds of events as a model.
And to bring it back to this question of art and labor, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking is, Jeff, you talked about strikes sort of interrupting the flow of labor, but I've also been thinking a lot about things that actually accelerate the flows of labor in very particular ways. Ai Weiwei's project that he did for the Tate Turbine Hall, for example, with the production of 100 million tiny porcelain sunflower seeds that were all hand-painted, actually completely changed the production of labor in this one tiny town in China for over a year. And the project's been talked about much in terms of the spectacle of that work, but not so much in terms of the labor that it would have taken to actually produce that and what it did to that community and to that town for that period of time. Okay, lots of interesting things here. Maybe we should open it up to the floor for questions. Em, do you have a microphone for people who want to ask something? If you don't, Em's just going to point to you.
Em just comes and points.
Is this thing on? Great. I just want to say thanks, first of all. It's a very interesting talk. There's a lot to respond to. I'm going to try and squeeze in two things. The first, briefly, if I can. Just a reminder of our context, which is that we are in the midst of a series of strikes which are punishingly traditional. The CUPE and the TSSU are on strike right now at SFU, at UBC, and a lot of people in this room are affected by that directly. Also, that we are in a building that 10 years ago was occupied. In fact, I think on this eve received one of many eviction notices. At the time, I think everyone was camped out on the sidewalk. And I think that's an exemplary form of a kind of pure means as human strike that maybe is useful in trying to create a definition that we can all tie our conversation to. So I guess my concern is that we're using or allowing ourselves to think about the general strike in terms of these definitions that come out of either its defeat or its compromise. So this idea of a withdrawal of labor in order to enact some sort of reform. And actually, I don't think it really gets to the aspirations of the general strike. And I think that the aspirations of the general strike has often been more like the human strike than is allowed to be acknowledged, which is to say that I think that the general strike made a claim for something that was incompatible. So not just a withdrawal of labor that would be temporary, but a complete alterity, something that was incompatible with the order of the day. And so in considering what artists could be doing in the form of a human strike, I think we can't ask how could we do less in a sense of withholding our labor from the art world, but how could we do something that is in fact incompatible with the art world, in particular the art market as it exists today. So I guess I just wanted to put that comment out there and see if you have a response.
Is that directed to me?
I guess it's targeted to everybody in the sense that, yeah, but I begin with you.
No, I think that's a excellent, I agree with you, absolutely. And to support that comment, there's a very interesting collective, sort of like Claire Fontaine, there's collectives popping up all over the place. Terry Communiste that would claim that the failure of the strikes of the 20th century, they fail insofar as they only squeeze out reforms, that there's this way in which they have actually assisted various neoliberal, or if you're looking at the 50s and 60s, a kind of post-World War II, this kind of shifting from a Keynesian and then slowly into a neoliberal way of thinking about profit maximization. And the point made there is that, of course, we need a sort of two-part punch. One would be subtraction, withdrawal, and of course there would inevitably have to be some kind of manifestation of resistance. I agree. It's a good point is being made by the collective that somehow, somewhere along the line in the 20th century, strikes lost their revolutionary component that would involve insurrectionary activity, forms of violent protest. So in my talk, I tried to suggest that critical visibilities aren't really working, right? That just unveiling social inequity is part of the problem. And perhaps just the idea of a strike is also part of a reformist program, that different kinds of visibility and broader forms of strike, which would be signaled by the shift from general to human, those all go together if we're going to expect something more than conciliatory reform. So that's very, 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 I'm grateful to you for that.
Yeah, I would just add it's a lovely spin on the defeatist and withdrawal to something more aspirational. I guess my thoughts on it are, I would agree with Jaleh that ultimately it doesn't feel like change is possible, but at the same time I think that individually we all experience changes, and each of us comes to these events within our own historical and cultural moment. So historically we can perhaps suggest that not that much has come out of it, but I would actually say that I think that as each of us are swept up in these moments within our own time, they become aspirational. I can only speak from my own experience, that I have been definitely moved by my participation in these events, that my own aspirations have shifted as a result of walking in solidarity with people. So I think in a sense what I would take from it is the notion that we have a simultaneous withdrawal and offering at the same time, that we recognize that something is lost and something is definitely broken, but also this notion of taking up a fight, whatever that might be. And also the notion of the human strike is something that mobilizes us together within some kind of human, larger human, and not just human, animal, planetary, mushrooms, fungi. I mean, I'm open to all of that. I think that, ideally that's what we take from it. And this notion, I think you used the word love in your presentation. The aspiration that we can take from it is that we are all sharing something together. So on the one hand, there is a sense of defeatism. There is a sense of the impossibility. And yet, I don't know why, I still think that change is possible inside of all of that. And I think it's possible within a kind of daily context of either, retreating within the home, making certain kinds of actions, but also, I guess in my own experience, working at Emily Carr and seeing artistic practices, increasingly seeing practices that are more collaborative than I've seen in the past few years, and also how social practice is taken up. Artists are not necessarily making objects anymore. And I see that as a powerful shift that starts to take up these ideas.
Yeah, this is an interesting point for me to think through, because like on the one hand, within the 20th century, like the last strike that's seen as transformational in some sense is the 1905 strikes across Russia, what those ignite, and that's why Luxemburg and Trotsky are writing about them in particular ways. Then I was trying through, in my small presentation, I was trying to make a bit of a balance between the notion of compromise, yet something small being one, and collaboration and participation. Because just with that personal narrative, or the narrative of a person that I constructed, in some ways I wouldn't be sitting here if there wasn't those small compromises weren't victories. If my father's union didn't get that 3% increase in 1972, then I wouldn't have been able to pay the $300 tuition to go to SFU in 1976. So those kinds of things, to me, I guess I was trying to make a point that I didn't elaborate in some sort of way, but more that I do think that these smaller moments of social reproduction are also tied into the other sites of production, the way that they mediate. They're perhaps not quite as separated in the way that the notions of the factory floor and domestic space, to me, those were much more fluid, and sometimes where they met were on the bricks and on the picket line. But so I think in some ways, the notion of someone like Tronte or someone like that saying that these strikes necessarily lead to failure. I don't know. They lead to like kind of small victories within different spheres at the same time. And yes, they are compromises, but I mean, a lot of those small compromises now would seem like kind of major victories within the revanchism and rollbacks of neoliberalism, unfortunately. So when I need to feel optimistic, I try to think things through in terms of scale. Like, so at what scale can we start to see these things become possible at? So the notion of subtraction and withdrawal, to me, that then empties a space, and empties a space in terms of the kinds of relations of productions that are within that space. And then you can refill that space through an occupation, or as you're pointing out, this building that was squatted after it sat empty for 15 years. And then once that occupation takes place, and what's the next step? In my kind of narrative, it would be self-management. And then from self-management, which Selma and Sabine and I have been talking about, self-management, a form of critique of that is that it's the management of already or pre-existing social subjects. But then we're trying to think through the notion of horizontalism or horizontalidad in terms of the production of new social subjects, which then don't organize themselves in a hierarchical manner. So that kind of subtraction, and then subtraction, withdrawal, and then occupation, and then production of new social subjects, for me is where I would find optimism, and then I would have to scale it down to where that would start happening. So then that's for me where the notion of the human strike starts to get more interesting, interesting within this framework, because it starts to give us a way to articulate or join different scales or sites of production, whether it's social reproduction, let's say at the domestic level, or social reproduction within the school. And I have to say, the notion of social reproduction for me was completely ruined, utterly ruined in a merciless way by Althusser. So I'm really happy to be able to kind of reclaim it in some kind of small way. So how to join these scales of domestic, schools, etc. Also just the way, the social air between us in some kind of sense. And then also, I would also say at points of production, whether that's art production or, where the iPhone 4S is made or something like that. So I scale down. That's why I say, like, withdrawal, subtraction, refill, reorganize, scale down, and then articulate scales.
Yes.
Oh,
Jenny?
wow. I don't know what to say after that. Jeff, I had a question somewhere. But thank you all. It's really fantastic to have the social space and to gather here to think about these important things in terms of the crisis of value production. And I guess it's also thinking about this model that we have here. If we stretch our temporality in different scales of time and space, is only one model. And I think you all alluded to that in different ways, giving us a different temporal extension. And I won't reiterate how each of you did that. So then if we think like that and we kind of expand the scale, we can also say that there's a possibility here of reevaluating what we value and not having the same desire, because I think that's been one of the problems, especially in the art world, somehow, somewhere, and I think it happened probably with the proliferation of the biennials and, internet technologies and cheaper forms of travel and forms of monetary kind of, flows of capital becoming easier, et cetera, in the mid-90s, 97. And I think one thing to say is that, okay, well, we're not going to desire the same thing anymore. We're just not, And also, if we say that, then it's only one version of reality, and just to withdraw from that one version is to accept that version. And so if we look at it, it's a philosophical, epistemological project of saying what is absence and what is the void, and is that void full of presence? And we are at a danger of losing epistemological structures, indigenous cultures, and languages that actually sustain a different kind of value. And that's not a romantic kind of suggestion, it's a reality. And alongside those values, there are anti-capitalist modes of sociality and relationships to non-extractive subjectivities that have yet to be realized and to be actually spread philosophically. And that's really important. And one of the things that I find problematic when I think of overdevelopment, uneven development, and accept the particular conditions that we're living under, which are brutal, they're violent, they're so harsh and dehumanizing in every way. You have to say, okay, if that's the condition that we live under, and we accept that as the dominant condition, and then we withhold, it seems like, in a way, it leads us to a tautological situation of complete despair. And I think, for me, I can't sustain that, like seriously, in terms of subjectivity, in terms of passion, in terms of desire. I want to alter that relation, that sense that that is our starting point of the conversation, that we accept this world order right now. We expand our temporality and say that there are other temporalities, other ways in which people all around the world, different scales, are not accepting that as reality. It's fundamentally about a kind of a different kind of subjectivization that we need to undergo. And you might say, well, that's impossible, but it's not. I mean, it's already there and it's at danger, but it's not like you have to say, okay, we withdraw from that. It's not just a withdrawal, it's a fullness of something else and other ways that people see reality that are disappearing under this kind of brutality that we're living under. So I think if we're artists, we need to look beyond what we already know, the theorists we bring up, and really open ourselves to what's happening. And I think that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try not to make this, the kind of things that we're talking about, the only reality that exists. There are parallel realities. And this neoliberal capitalist order that we're living in under these incredibly violent conditions is not the only order possible. And I think I have to have that. And not as an idealist, I'm not a utopic thinker. I come from a country that I see what's happened in terms of the hyper-capitalist South Korea and, basically totalitarianism in terms of a communist monarchy in North Korea. So I'm not being idealistic. I understand what happened historically there. But I just want to point that out, because if we keep referring to the same place, we just return, and then it's cynical. Either you kind of become the ready-made and say, well, there's nothing to be done about it, and then we capitulate. And that's just depressing to me. I mean, and it's not fair. I mean, our students need more than that. And it's not to give false hope or to say diminish the actual conditions we're living under. But that, for me, is a philosophical, ethical issue. And I think that we need to work on that, to look to different kinds of epistemologies and how we know things. Sorry, that was rather long-winded myself, but really, I just can't feel that it's kind of a nihilist game, end game,
Do you want to respond? Anybody?
Well, yeah, when I mentioned the silver lining in Claire Fontaine's seemingly very negative, all-encompassing position, I think the suggestion there is if withdrawal isn't withdrawal in a vacuum. It's not just withdrawal in general. It's withdrawal from a certain economy that is individualistic, proprietorial, goal-driven, instrumental, means ends. The minute you put that aside and withdraw from that, I think what they're suggesting is that a whole horizon opens up where you can have you can have a life world that is organized other than individualistic, proprietorial, that those are, to use your terms, a set of epistemes that have been put in place by capital that don't necessarily precede them, or not set in place by capital, that are historically, they're entwined in a way, and we think we can't see outside of it, but we might just need this kind of kickstarter of a negativity in order to see these other possibilities. I think what's being suggested already in the form of a collective itself, I think what Claire Fontaine is doing, without necessarily talking about it, is suggesting forms of solidaritas co-care. And that's part of the very strange name, Claire Fontaine. You know, they're really just a collective of two people. I'd be curious to see where they go with that in the future.
I guess what comes to mind for me with what you were saying, Jinmi, and what we're talking about here, but I guess particularly as you're talking, I'm thinking about my immediate context of teaching and this idea of giving students more than that. I mean, I don't think of myself, I'm incredibly optimistic, and I don't know why, but there it is. And what I was thinking about was how we structure curriculum and how we structure the class model. And these are the things in my immediate sphere that I think are really important, but I can't help but see, even in my own institution, how the canon is being taught in such a narrow way, and in my own challenges of trying to, through kind of various means, trying to open that up, and it keeps getting shut down. So this kind of model that you're talking about, I think, is perpetuated in the sausage factory, as Jeff was referring to, and that is, for me at least, the immediate place of trying to challenge it, both in what we teach, certainly, and that's a challenge. I mean, it's just stupid how we still have the same old, canon, but also how we teach. And how we create a space, and this is the idea of the withdrawal to open up a space, but how we create a space for students to discover their own agency. And that agency often can sort of undermine my authority. And that's when it gets very interesting and very exciting. And how to manage that. And how to manage that in a room full of people who some want the authority to continue and others are excited to exercise their creative sensibility within the classroom. So that's just my first thought in what you were presenting is the larger epistemic issues that you're talking about, but how do we practice it? How do we practice it in our practices and our writing practices in the classroom and in our daily interactions that challenge these default ways of responding? And that's this idea, I think, that Jeff is talking about of scales. So in the immediate sense, the idea is how do you unpack the classroom? How do you find a space where you're not the authority, even as you are expected to be the authority? That's my immediate thought, is what you're saying.
And just quickly, I think that the notion of a moment of negativity or moment of the negative as a kickstart to me is actually, as Jaleh just said, to me is quite useful to think through what you propose to us, Jinmi, because I think when we think this through in terms of values and valuation and value, I think then we need this kickstart of the negative to think through how neoliberalism as a economic and social software actually has been a kind of revolution at the level of value, and particularly in the way that people are treated as things, and within a neoliberal and neoclassical economy sees people as things. We get treated as objects. And so to rethink the value that creates. So I mean, when I think it through spatially, I tend to literally think of the social space between people and the way that neoliberalism has distorted that space through itself as a software, and to rethink other values. And so that for me is where I would join in with you, saying we have to look elsewhere, whether that elsewhere is to the past, whether it's other geographic sites, or whether it's some imagined future. But for me, it's key to think through how do we create a different kind of value that allows us to treat each other different in some sense, whether that's as a solidaritous co-care collective, which I think Helma and Sabine and I have to start using around the house now when we're deciding who's cooking and cleaning and stuff. But just a way of creating different value between social subjects, because we were talking about creating different social subjects, but also to create, different kind of value in the space between them as well.
You also mentioned that I don't relate to anything more than I do with your statement that your students deserve better than that. And much of my interest in this problem of the general strike and Claire Fontaine's human strike really surfaced through my experiences teaching in the last 10 years, especially the rather shocking differential between teaching in the United States and teaching this past year and 2 months in Canada. And I think when you ask yourself, or when you tell yourself that your students deserve better, that's where withdrawal becomes even more of an imperative. Because you realize that it's precisely because they do deserve what they deserve that it might be wiser to stop this production and circulation system that puts them into ever greater debt, is pushing more and more and more people into a kind of degree factory where the values of those degrees are just plummeting. So, you have a situation, at least for artists, where, the GI Bill is introduced in World War II, and then that creates a situation where artists feel that they have to get degrees, and now you have a situation where it's not enough to have an MFA, and PhDs are being introduced, and, you just wonder, where does this stop, this kind of, this sausage factory of debt acquisition? So again, it's precisely because all community members deserve better that it might be the kinder choice to withdraw from the addiction that one sets in place in the teacher-student paradigm in the classroom. It's sort of like, I love you, therefore I'm not going to enable this kind of defeatist system that I have been produced by and that I'm producing you in. At a certain point, repetition is not an especially kind or loving way of moving forward.
But there's so many other forms of knowledge, and people are doing that in terms of self-study. And I think one of the greatest things that I feel about an art school, this kind of education, where we're thinking and being in a context like this, is being a fearless autodidact, that you are not subservient to people who have greater and greater, the letters behind them. You can speak up whenever you want, and if you want to read a night, you can read what you want. You can jump in the middle. You don't have to kind of like being a citational culture. And in terms of that, yes, and in terms of PhDs, in terms of visual arts, I say, unless you make an exhibition or some other equivalent of a dissertation, forget it. But I think that's like, or else we would think of some other models in which we're going to withdraw and do a school model or something else.
Exactly.
Students do. But on the other hand, this is an issue of scales, and that I feel that, in fact, I think I do need quite a void for the students to be the experts of their own domain and what they want to study, what they want to learn, what they want to make. And I don't see that as a kind of withdrawal of responsibility. It's a co-shared space. And yes, I'm being paid, there's different relations, they're getting into debt. That's one model, but it's still not completely a bankrupt model. I mean, I think in
It is.
One of the things that I've read that I thought was really encouraging was a series of interviews that Julia Kristeva did on the legacy of May 1968 and, of course, the so-called failure of the student revolution to actually sort of overthrow the government and turn power. And that she sort of recuperates the psychological aspects of revolution. And that what May 1968 eventually... the legacy of it was really that it represented a fundamental right to question, a kind of agency that people felt afterwards, and that's something that's very particular of that generation. The fundamental right to question the dominant powers of structure, the right to question ideas of sexuality, of gender, on a whole bunch of different levels that weren't just about this idea of sort of replacing the government or stopping labor necessarily. So I think what we've really explored in interesting ways in this discussion is the idea of the strike and its kind of broadest impacts. You've all spoken to what it means, what it's meant to you personally, the kind of anecdotal, but also what it means in the art world, and also what it means sort of theoretically as well. And I think the breadth of that discussion really shows us that the idea of the strike still has revolutionary potential. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I had, going off of maybe what you had just said, I wanted to use a few local examples that might provoke something from the front, but working within the argument of the talk. And the separation between the Santiago Sierra and the Claire Fontaine. The Santiago Sierra being along the lines of what you just brought in from 68 as being, despite the failures of the revolution, we now can move into a mode of critique or a mode of questioning or the right to ask questions or something that you just said. And I want to give a local example to maybe further Jaleh's point, not about the inadequacy of merely, bringing something. You use the word visibility for the visibility in the case of Santiago Sierra, highlighting the heads of the workers. The local example is the local example is last two weeks or 3 weeks ago or something. The BCGU, the BC Government Employees Union, did a quote-unquote general strike. It was a day-long general strike. And the idea there was, we're going to withdraw our labor for 1 day. We're going to close the liquor stores and a few other branches of the BCGU in order precisely to make visible our labor, to show that we exist and so on. Essentially, the least interesting part of the general strike in the 20th century, to follow on your sort of classification of the different abilities for the strike to bring out something within social relations. So for me, just as my critique at the same time as going further with your point, the opposition for me is not precisely the one you're making between, on the one hand, the human strike as the withdrawal of labor, on the other hand, quote-unquote social justice as making visible relations of domination. Rather, I would want to move towards general strike as social force, as social exertion of the power of labor, or violence. Say, in Benjamin's Critique of Violence, he uses the general strike with George Sorel, or the Rosa Luxemburg essay with the general strike, is the title of the essay. A general strike as a form of withdrawal, as a form of exerting the force of labor within social reproduction and accumulation, versus making visible relations of power, and so on, and so on, and so on. Claire Fontaine I see as being a collective practice that's attempting to bring that within the domestic space, bring that within interpersonal relations, and so on. But I would want to caution against merely, I would want to supplement the general strike within social relations, within the home, and not as a replacement of previous forms of general strike, but rather a critique of their failure in the 20th century in our terms today. So the inability to take up the gender critique, the inability to critique colonial relations, and these sort of oversights of the narrow class struggle around which general strikes have taken place. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't. So that would, and so I think it's a grave mistake to say, in the way that you said in your talk, that because certain general strikes in the 20th century produced some reformist outcomes in the massive conflict between capital and labor, for example, because they produced some reformist outcomes, that those general strikes as imminent expressions of social force, in the way that Gabe is saying, as forms of withdrawal that aren't dependent upon what they're critiquing, just because they produce reformist outcomes doesn't mean they themselves imminently were failures. So that to me is a mistake. But
do you want to respond, or? Are there other questions, or maybe we could end on that very lovely comment as well?
I mean, I can respond to that. Just, it's an interesting question. So,
okay.
Maybe
Thanks,
as you were talking, I was thinking maybe it's the notion of a generalized strike, then in a sense, where one that can encompass the kinds of kind of larger social relations that you're asking a strike to do. So to think of the strike as a supplement, I think supplement was the term that you used. So it's asserting the force of labor, perhaps at the same time as it's making visible, right? And where I would say that there's a value for making labor visible is today, because of the way that labor has been made, particularly labor as a process and as a value, has been made more and more invisible because of the kind of revanchism toward labor by neoliberalism, right? So without it, I'm a little bit tired, so I'm not kind of totally focusing on exactly what you're saying, but I think that there is a value in both of those things in some sense, the making visible and the assertion of the force of labor. And then to look at the ways that that those things that perhaps within a particular discourse around strike and around labor that we have maybe inherited, that some of those things we might look traditionally at as being, or might have been thought of as failures now, are actually, as I was suggesting, things that were important at the moment, and they added something to a social terrain. That's why, I don't want to fall back on this narrative subject, but I think there's moments where those things can simultaneously be kinds of compromises and kinds of victories. And, they can be a victory on the picket line, and they can be a victory in the household as well. And they can be a victory in other sites of social reproduction. I think that's what I was kind of trying to get at, but you had a more forceful point than that.
I think it's important to bear in mind that the word failure isn't a judgment, a kind of static statement from on high outside of time. Failure is part of a historical dialectical process. So, of course, it's bound up with its own incremental successes. We've had 40 years of art making that are about making visible the invisible. It's tiring. It's part of a kind of not only a general redundancy, but also it's bound up with productivism and it's bound up with surveillance. And so it might be interesting to try and, the point of withdrawal for Claire Fontaine is about a kind of problem in a hyper-accelerated late capitalist mode that is suicidal. That's their whole point, that there's a crisis that is internal to the general law of accumulation. So we're hitting this kind of fizzling out point, which is also has nothing to do with failure. The failure of capitalism is the success of the human. So there's always kind of that kind of spiral within historical formations and dialectics. But their other point that I didn't really focus on in the parameters of tonight's presentation is how we deal with a police state that is always punishing us for our successes. And so one of those, the problem there is that visibility becomes our self-betrayal. And I think Sierra is showing that to some degree, that invisibility becomes a kind of protective mantle. And this is part of a whole conversation this past year around like black bloc tactics and things of that nature. So I don't want to condemn visibility as such from some ahistorical vantage point, but only to situate it within a historical moment wherein visibility has been it hasn't necessarily helped the most progressive or critical vantage, which doesn't mean it won't in 10 years and 20 years and 15 years, or maybe in some instances now, such as the one that you pinpoint. But within art making, which is about vision and visibility and visuality, it might be the case that a certain form or a certain practice of withdrawal is all that we have left, at least at the moment. So to add more layers.
I believe we have one more question in the back, so let's make this our last question.
Hi, everyone. I'll try to make it really short. So this is kind of, it's like I'll make a statement. I'm wondering if this is unfair, if you would agree with it. I always thought of a strike as extremely effective and positive strategy, and like historically in the 19th century, the idea of the strike arising, it not only made visible that, for example, there was a working class that was without whom the system of production was impossible. Not only made them visible, but it was empowering, and so the working class became aware of its power, and that was part of the idea of the general strike, and it was, or any kind of strike. And I think it was very well understood that if, say, workers, for example, in a factory organized together and shut down production, the system stopped. So, like, I always think of the strike as building of class consciousness or some kind of consciousness. And if you organize it properly and everyone is on board and there's solidarity and you organize a strike, then you stop the system. And depending on your goal, you could ask for reforms, or you can have a larger goal if it's a general strike across different fields. But I wonder, because the word failure has come up for me, and so my proposal would be that any failure would simply be a failure to implement a strike properly. Not that strikes are inherently problematic, but through all of my organizing experience, the only time we lose is if we don't have solidarity across the board to implement the strike properly. And it's important because, just for example, in the 19th century, say when strikes were coming around, a dominant ideology is there's the government, there's the ruling class, and they're the ones that make everything happen. But then when there start to be socialist ideas, then it totally flipped everything, and it became really clear to everyone that without, say, a working class or the people, that the entire system would completely collapse, and that the ruling class was a small, little, parasitic, little icing on top of the system that you could do away with. So, just for example, Nietzsche, who had been a dominant philosopher of aristocracy, would have said that we need the ruling class, we need the noblemen, we need the nobles, and that's what makes society possible. But a strike puts the lie to that, and it makes any kind of system where you implement an effective strike collapse. So it's not that my question would be, isn't the only failure if you don't implement the strike rigorously and completely?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yes. Is that unanimous? Yes?
I feel a kind of sense of conflict, which is a good place to be in, between visibility and failure. It's a really interesting way to think about it, because this notion of failure as being productive is really profound. I understand what you're saying about the way you took up failure, but I think failure is a really productive mode. But I also think visibility, I don't think it's boring. I think it's still necessary. I think that we still need to take up space. We still need to articulate these alternative views, these alternative ways of being. So I feel conflicted by recognizing withdrawal and this notion of the human strike as being a kind of necessary approach and strategy. But I also think personally that I can't withdraw because things still need to be said, and bodies still need to move in space. So I guess what I'm left with at this point is a sense of conflict and a kind of paradox that I think is maybe just the nature of being human, and that's this idea of the pleasure of protest and the pleasure of being in the arena in some way.
Perhaps we would think through, too, a politics of visibility on one sense versus a politics of recognition. Because there's ways of being visible without being recognized. Thinking of Charles Taylor's implementation of politics of recognition that has served the state in Canada very well. So maybe that's one frame to think through that problematic.
And maybe on that note, we'll end for this evening. I'd like to thank Jaleh Mansoor, Jeff Dirksen, and Randy Lee Cutler for their wonderful contribution tonight, and for Am Johel for bringing us all together for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.